We have with us this afternoon Mr. Robert Mason Beecroft, who is a commissioned officer in the U.S. Senior Foreign Service with the rank of Career Minister Counselor. In April of 1998, he was appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary for Regional Affairs in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs at the Department of State. His most recent overseas assignment, 1996 to 1997, was as Chief of Mission and Special Envoy for the Bosnian Federation at the United States Embassy in Sarajevo. Mr. Beecroft joined the State Department in 1971. Prior to Sarajevo, he held overseas assignments at the U.S. embassies in Paris, Bonn, Cairo, Amman, and Ouagadougou. I hope I pronounced it right. No, Ouagadougou. I looked it up in the dictionary, and it is north of Ghana. The latter two as Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. mission to NATO and SHAPE military headquarters in Belgium, and as a member of the U.S. SOL II strategic nuclear arms negotiating team in Geneva. In Washington, he has served as Special Assistant to the Deputy Secretary of State, Officer in charge of Federal German Affairs, and Nuclear Arms Control Specialist in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs. He is a 1988 graduate of the U.S. Naval War College when he conducted research on political and strategic issues. Before coming to the Bureau of Political and Military Affairs, he was a member of the 40th Senior Seminar at the National Foreign Affairs Training Center. Mr. Beecroft is the recipient of 2 Personal Superior Honor Awards, 4 Group Superior Honor Awards, Performance Pay, a Meritorious Step Increase, and the National War College Dakor Prize for Analysis. A frequent public spokesman and advocate for U.S. foreign policy, he has served as a speaker, panelist, and commentator on television and radio and in public gatherings on 4 continents, including appearances over the past 6 years in Boston, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Los Angeles, Tokyo, Amman, Vilnius, Hamburg, Zagreb, and at Cambridge University. Born in Newark, New Jersey, Mr. Beecroft completed secondary education at the Hotchkiss School of Lakeville, Connecticut. He attended the University of Pennsylvania, where he received a BA and an MA in French. He studied in Paris at the Sorbonne and in Munich at the Goethe Institute, and on the postgraduate level at the University of Strasbourg. Before joining the Foreign Service, Mr. Beecroft taught at the University of Pennsylvania, St. Joseph University, and Germantown Academy, and at the Lycée d'État Faustin de Cologne in Strasbourg. He served in the U.S. Army Reserve. Mr. Beecroft is fluent in French, German, Norwegian, and Danish, and is conversant in several other languages. But don't worry, he will speak in English. His hobbies include music, listening and performing, archaeology, snorkeling, tennis, hiking, and U.S. Civil War history. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Robert Mason Beecroft to the Council.
I think I should quit while I'm ahead. I am delighted to be here. It is always a pleasure for me to visit this vibrant, engaging city, a city that has played and continues to play an important role in our nation's foreign affairs. Baltimore is, in fact, the kind of 21st century global city that comes to mind when the world thinks of America. I don't need to tell any of you about Baltimore's key role in global commerce, and indeed, Alan Larson stressed it anew. And the city's role in defending the nation against foreign attacks during the War of 1812 is certainly familiar to all of you. As a Civil War historian, I'm also interested in the travails of Abraham Lincoln trying to get from one railroad station to another in 1861, but that's another issue. How many of you know, though, that Baltimore's global reach even extends to the highest levels of the Department of State? You should recall that my boss, Madeleine Albright, wore an Orioles jacket when she threw out the first pitch of the season 2 years ago, the first Secretary of State ever to have performed that duty. Now, I'm a Philadelphia Phillies fan. I know what it means to suffer. But I couldn't help wondering over the past couple of weeks whether there might not be some thought being given to asking Mrs. Albright to return as a member of the bullpen. It's looking a little better now, though. In fact, Secretary Albright has broken the mold in a number of ways since she assumed her post, often considered by the public to be a position filled by stuffy, striped pants cookie pushers. Just as Madeleine Albright has broken that traditional mold, so too has our nation broken away from the patterns of behavior of our Cold War past. And I can speak personally and attest to you that we in the Foreign Service almost never wear striped pants, and personally I haven't pushed a cookie in years. To understand how this has come to be, it's important to understand also how the global security environment has changed. To adapt to this new global environment, and why our response leads some to describe us as the reluctant superpower, and what our new position means for the roles and missions that our military must take on at the dawn of the 21st century. It's also important to understand the challenges we face as we strive to combine diplomacy and force in pursuit of our national interest. Let me briefly describe for you the role of the bureau that I represent in the Department of State, the Bureau of Political Military Affairs. We deal in many ways with the line of the connection between the Department of State and the Department of Defense. We deal with regional political military affairs worldwide. We deal with peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace enforcement. We deal directly, and I deal personally, with humanitarian demining, on which the United States spends more money than the rest of the world combined. We deal with arms sales and arms transfers, both leaving the United States and entering the United States. We deal with some aspects of counterterrorism. You will recall the attacks on our embassies in Africa last year, in which my bureau played an important role in the response. We conduct what are called security dialogues with countries around the world that want to hear what the United States has to say about their security, and conversely, we want to hear what they have to say. I returned a couple of weeks ago from security dialogues in Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, which included meetings with President Shevardnadze and his colleagues in the other two countries in the region. As I mentioned, we are the link to the Pentagon in the Department of State, a two-way street increasingly. We also assign political advisors who are career diplomats to the major commands around the world. And I can tell you that the generals in those commands and the admirals seek that kind of advice and welcome it. It gives them a perspective on what they do that goes beyond the purely military to the political aspects that color what they are asked to do. And finally, we do what is called political military planning. You've probably heard the expression SOP, Standard Operating Procedure. Well, until recently, there were those who in the Department of State thought that SOP means seat of pants. We have changed that. We are now seriously involved in a political military planning approach which attempts to anticipate the kinds of crises that I think will become all too endemic in the much messier, more unpredictable Cold War, post-Cold War world in which we now live. and the outlines of which are only beginning to become clear. One of the plans that we work on is Kosovo. I will not talk about Kosovo in my prepared remarks, but I will be prepared to take questions from you afterwards. In the most basic terms, today's security environment is dynamic, uncertain, and increasingly interdependent. This is not as new as it sounds. A century ago, President William McKinley noted, and I quote, "The world's products are exchanged as never before, and with increasing transportation comes increasing knowledge and larger trade. Isolation is no longer possible." What is new is that this interdependence, fostered by globalization, is happening with ever-accelerating speed. The forces of integration, expanding trade, communications, transportation, cultural links, the internet, offer us an unprecedented opportunity to build new bonds among individuals and between nations. But they also present new and complex challenges. The same forces that bring us closer also make us more vulnerable to the effects of extreme nationalism, as in the Balkans, terrorism, crime, environmental damage, and the complex flows of trade and investment that know no borders. We live in a world in which the greatest single threat to United States security is the spread and possible use of weapons of mass destruction, what are called in the jargon WMD. The post-Cold War paradox is that while the threat of a massive strategic nuclear exchange has receded, the danger of WMD use by states, by groups, or by individuals has increased. I'm talking about chemical weapons, biological weapons, radiological weapons, and suitcase nuclear weapons. Our world is one in which national well-being is increasingly influenced by cross-border flows of people, money, weapons, drugs, and disease. These problems are global, but their impact can be local. We also live in a world where open societies and open markets are potent forces, and in which non-governmental actors play a growing role in resolving conflicts, influencing policies, and delivering humanitarian aid services. The Cold War struggle between democracy and dictatorship has given way to a struggle between the forces of integration and disintegration. The Cold War challenge of managing a constant strategic threat has given way to the challenge of managing ceaseless and accelerating change. In the bad old days of the Cold War, only 10 years ago, the balance of nuclear terror inhibited both superpowers from confronting each other directly. The United States focused its diplomatic and military energies on containing the spread of Soviet influence. At the same time, much of the Third World decried United States and Western attempts to assert our influence in doing so, lumping us together as ill-intentioned imperialists, intruders at the gates of their national sovereignty. Today, a decade after the Berlin Wall came tumbling down, with a crash that undermined the foundations of the Cold War system, we are the sole remaining superpower, whether we like it or not. Temptations to assert our power confront us at every twist and turn in the international system. Demands to do so dog us at every step. And many Americans and their representatives in Congress would prefer to close the door and turn out the lights, not to engage. This is not new. The tension between American engagement and American, let's call it by its real name, isolationism, is as old as the Republic. Now, when nations struggle with internal conflict, as in Angola, or when states clash over conflicting interests, as in Ethiopia and Eritrea, More often than not, we hear calls for U.S. engagement. From Namibia to Nepal, the word is out on the street that the U.S., the biggest kid on the block, is the only one with the resources, the experience, the organizational capabilities, and the global reach to effectively intervene to stop bloodshed and to calm turbulent societies. I would also add that the United States cultivates one characteristic which is in short supply in the world, and that is leadership. Indeed, many universities in this country give courses in leadership, and yet the word can't even be translated into many other languages. In French, it is le leadership. Instead of reaping expected post-Cold War peace dividends in a utopian world of global harmony, we and our allies, particularly in NATO, have found a greater demand for conflict prevention, crisis management, peacekeeping, conflict resolution, and, as in Bosnia, Iraq, and Kosovo, direct military intervention to achieve our diplomatic intervention objectives and to restore the peace. This has placed serious strains on our military colleagues. Where once they had the relatively static mission to deter and defend, they now must also shape and engage. I would add, and Ambassador Larson alluded to this, that it has also strained our diplomatic resources nearly to the breaking point. To give you a bit of perspective in that regard, I would point out that the entire commissioned U.S. Foreign Service Officer Corps numbers fewer than 5,000 people. The crew of an American aircraft carrier numbers about 5,500, and we have 12 aircraft carriers. To paraphrase a recent comment by Marine Corps General Anthony Zinni, and I quote, "I once would have felt comfortable knowing that I had the 82nd Airborne on my left and the 101st on my right. Now I know I'm more likely to have USAID on my left and Save the Children on my right." Yet, even though we may feel uncomfortable in navigating this new world disorder, our position of leadership demands decisive action of us and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. We cannot shrink from our obligations to lead as the world's remaining superpower, even though we may often seem reluctant to do so. The new security environment will not allow us that luxury. Why then does it sometimes seem so difficult for the United States to exercise effective force in support of diplomacy, to go to a foreign policy full-court press instead of a zone defense? Why is it that we sometimes appear a reluctant superpower? I would offer that there are very good reasons, both historical and geographic. Historically, America's foreign policy until quite recently was one of limited engagement and outright isolationism. Washington's farewell address, in which he warned against, quote, interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, unquote, set the tone for many years. Until World War I, the United States had no ambassadors overseas. We frankly didn't care that much about the rest of the world. The heads of our embassies were ministers, the second rank, not ambassadors. Even our early muscle flexing in the Spanish-American War of 1898 was considered an exception and an anomaly by many in this country. As we extended our reach into the Caribbean and the Pacific, eventually driving the Spanish out of Cuba and annexing the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, and Hawaii, American voices were raised against such expansion on practical and moral grounds. In the case of the Philippines, President Teddy Roosevelt, who had encouraged Admiral Dewey to take Manila in the first place, did a quick about-face and realized he didn't want the place after all. By the 1930s, we had decided to give the Philippines its independence. In fact, historically, we have been terrible imperialists. We also saw great initial reluctance on the part of our statesmen to involve ourselves in the First World War. President Wilson tried to maintain a policy of neutrality until we were drawn into the vortex by German belligerents on the high seas. After World War I, Wilson tried to set a more active internationalist course, only to see his hopes for a League of Nations deflated when the U.S. Congress declined to make us members. So we retreated from the international stage. Other nations interpreted that as an aversion to involvement and an invitation to aggression. Within a generation, we found ourselves once again entangled in a world war, this time in Europe and in Asia. After the nightmare of World War II, we thought again about whether we should leave. Few recall now the heated debates in the United States Congress in 1945, 46, and 47, which nearly led to a second American withdrawal from the world stage. In fact, we have Uncle Joe Stalin to thank for the fact that NATO exists at all. The Berlin blockade concentrated minds in a way that changed our attitude. We launched the United Nations. We stationed a long-term military presence on the European continent. And we created NATO to protect and to project our transatlantic security interests. Churchill's famous phrase that the real purpose of NATO is to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down has some truth to it. We had come a long way since Washington's farewell address. After the Cold War, though, a decade ago, less than a decade ago, we began to hear calls again for a retreat from the world stage. But so far, the neo-isolationists have failed to sever our crucial bonds from the rest of the world. Geography also explains the reluctant superpower. Safely nestled between two oceans, bordered by friendly neighbors and our largest markets, America has been blessed by Providence with a natural security that our European friends can only envy. This sense of living in Fortress America has shaped our reluctance to wield the full measure of our might when our national interests demand that we do so. And let us never forget, deep in our souls we know that the majority of Americans, or their forebears, came here to get away from someplace else. Finally, our political system has frequently defined our ability, if not our willingness, to actively engage in world affairs. Tip O'Neill's famous comment that all politics is local well describes how those whose fingers are on the federal purse strings look at spending when it comes to foreign affairs, particularly non-military foreign affairs. Pork barrels are hard to find in the foreign policy community, though they do exist there too. But today, international affairs spending adds up to about 1% of the federal budget. 1%. And that includes all of our aid programs. You'll seldom hear a congressman or a senator boasting about my constituency at the Department of State. How has all of this affected the role of the U.S. military in the post-Cold War world? During the Cold War, United States military strategy, doctrine, and tactics focused on the Soviet threat. The response was a static defense and a massive defense. I'm sure there are some in this room who have sat in the Fulda Gap, the famous dividing line in southern Germany, where the assumption was that the Soviet tank divisions would come crashing onto the Rhine plain. Of course, there was also a massive nuclear threat, known as mutual assured destruction, one of the more grotesque terms of the 20th century. Mutual assured destruction basically paralyzed the world into two camps, each camp having its own allies and satellites of one sort or another. That's gone. The world now is much more untidy, much more unpredictable, and in terms of alliances, much more uneven than it was a decade ago. The threat is dispersed. It comes in different shapes and sizes, from a small terrorist group using firearms and hand grenades to a rogue state brandishing medium-range missiles. As a result, the U.S. military has taken on new roles, such as shaping the environment and responding to a full spectrum of crises. In addition to diplomatic, trade, and investment issues of national power, the United States military plays an essential role in shaping the international security environment in ways that promote and protect United States interests. Our military promotes regional stability by bolstering the security of key allies and friends, and working to adapt and strengthen our crucial alliances, in particular NATO and its associated Partnership for Peace. Since 1994, National Guard units from nearly 24 American states have conducted exercises in host countries involving peacekeeping skills, humanitarian aid, maritime search and rescue, convoy operations, and mine and countermine measures. Last summer, almost 1,200 Kentucky National Guard soldiers exercised with the Ecuadorian Army in Ecuador. In 1997, Exercise Baltic Challenge brought National Guard units from Maryland, Michigan, and Pennsylvania to the Baltic to exercise with their partner nations Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The Indiana and Alabama National Guards have participated in a humanitarian exercise in Romania involving rehabilitation of a hospital, a daycare center, and an orphanage for HIV-infected children. America's armed forces also keep the peace, from Bosnia to the Sinai. They rescue and rebuild lives in hurricane-ravaged Central America, and they reinforce stability by remaining forward deployed in smaller numbers in Europe and Asia. In the Persian Gulf region, United States and British forces continue to undertake sustained military action to contain Saddam Hussein and degrade Iraq's ability to deliver chemical, nuclear, and biological weapons and threaten its neighbors. And most important of all, we are leading NATO's effort to right the dreadful injustices that have taken place and continue to take place inside Kosovo, where the last of Europe's totalitarian dictators is behaving in ways that we all hoped were a thing of the past. How do such developments affect and shape our pursuit of national security interests? Over a millennium ago, closer to 2 millennia, the Roman historian Tacitus asserted that a bad peace is even worse than war. Much more recently, Benjamin Franklin, not a mean diplomat himself, stood Tacitus on his head and argued that there never was a good war or a bad peace. These opposing viewpoints reflect the key challenges and dilemmas that U.S. policymakers are facing when they consider the political-military dimensions of our national security policy. For us, and for you, the key challenges are to discern where our interests lie in a given situation, to determine whether we're willing to take the necessary risks to secure those interests, and to calibrate the diplomatic and military instruments of our national power for maximum effect should we decide to act. Let's look briefly at each of these. First, where do our interests lie? The question of where and when to engage politically and/or militarily is crucial. Whether the problem is military conflict or major economic or social disruption, as a world leader, we must shoulder our responsibilities and protect our national and international interests. The reluctant superpower cannot intervene in every instance. Neither can our allies or any regional or international organization. Yet there are clear moral dilemmas in choosing to help in some situations and to allow suffering to continue in others. In a world knit so closely together, politically, economically, and socially, it is hard to draw a line and to identify where U.S. interests begin and end. A conflict that spills over in one part of the world can hurt U.S. interests and our economy and limit our access to natural resources. Should we deal with such conflicts while they're far from our borders to prevent them from spreading? Should we wait until friends, allies, and markets are affected by them and by their consequences? Or do we only engage at the water's edge? These are the questions we deal with all the time. Will we take the necessary risks? Are we as a nation willing to take such risks to advance and preserve our interests? Americans are a naturally generous people who like to fix problems. We like to deal with a challenge, be done with it, and turn to the next one. Our patience tends to be short. We also find it difficult to ignore the strife and suffering that we see on CNN. We often see the need for involvement, but they want that involvement to be very low in blood and treasure. The sentiment is understandable, but we cannot do national security or foreign policy on the cheap. Third is the balance between force and diplomacy. What is the right mix? Credible military force and the demonstrated will to use that force are essential to defend our vital interests and keep America safe. But we all know that force alone cannot solve all problems. One of the articles of faith in the United States military today is what is called jointness, which means acting together without the kind of competitiveness among the various military services which marked their cooperation in the past. They call this purple. They call it purple because when you mix the colors of the various uniforms together, they come out purple. I have argued that they should be adding pinstripes to their purple, diplomatic pinstripes, because more and more diplomats and the military work hand in hand. I did it every day in Sarajevo. To be most effective, force, diplomacy, and our other policy tools must complement and reinforce each other. Clearly, the defense of our country requires both the capacity and the will to use force when necessary. But force can be a blunt instrument, and it nearly always entails grave risks. So our security also requires the vigorous use of more precise diplomatic tools. In political military terms, this means finding the right balance between diplomacy and the use of force. It means using our diplomatic leverage to keep our allies together when we use force collectively, as in Kosovo. And it also means using force or the threat of force when necessary to persuade our opponents to avoid military confrontation and to accept a diplomatic solution to a problem. This notion is perhaps most vividly illustrated by the description of an aircraft carrier as 90,000 tons of diplomacy, a clear symbol of power projection that serves useful diplomatic ends, even if, or perhaps especially if, an airplane never takes off from the deck. In short, the combination of force and diplomacy can be a potent tool in advancing our national security interests. Historically, the notion of the velvet glove of diplomacy, working with the iron fist of military force, has dominated various models of statecraft. The Arab proverb, "Let the sword decide after the stratagem has failed," nicely sums up this approach to conflict resolution. Orthodox practitioners of this approach to statecraft typically advocated exhausting all diplomatic means in a conflict before resorting to force. The League of Nations Covenant bolstered this view, calling on members to avoid resort to war without first exhausting diplomatic means. Later, the UN Charter changed this a little, allowing the threat of force or the use of force only in cases of self-defense or collective action authorized by the United Nations Security Council. This perspective still has adherents today, but in the last century, the great powers of Europe often intervened in the affairs of sovereign states to settle disputes that threatened their stability. Although such intervention lacked international constitutional authority, some jurists did support the view that humanitarian intervention to prevent a state from committing atrocities against its own subjects was recognized by international law. This argument may well have renewed relevance in Kosovo today. In short, there have been and likely always will be cases in which the resort to the use of military force is the preferred option even before all diplomatic means have been expended. Let me sum up as follows. Rather than viewing diplomacy and force as opposing ends of a spectrum of national policy, with one to be used when the other fails, I believe the challenge is to see both as intertwined and interconnected, to use each to support the other to the maximum effect, where possible, falling short of the actual use of force and the putting of our soldiers, sailors, and airmen and women in harm's way. Just as force, or the threat of force, judiciously applied, can increase the chances for diplomatic success in negotiations to end a conflict, so too can effective diplomacy be a force multiplier. The skill with which the United States, the reluctant superpower, employs these two in this tandem fashion will determine the success or failure of our national security policy in the new millennium. As we enter that millennium, we will face and continue to face a difficult choice between leading or following. The correct choice, I believe, is clear. Our native inclination to be reluctant about engagement notwithstanding, we must shoulder our global responsibilities. Dean Rusk, Secretary of State in the 1960s, was a Georgian with a sense of humor so dry it crackled. He once said the following: "At any time of the day or night, 2/3 of the people on earth are awake, and some of them are up to no good." As long as that is true, there will be work for the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beecroft, for such an informative presentation. We will entertain some questions now, and again, please use the microphones on either side of the room. Yes, ma'am.
Secretary Beecroft, I'm an American citizen, and I'm following your war on the internet, and I am appalled. At this point, we have destroyed every bridge on the Danube River. We have wiped out, as of 1 p.m. this afternoon, 60% of the Yugoslav Air Force. And thank you. And let's put it this way, it's an undeclared war. However, the sad thing is that we are hiding behind, and you can answer this as any way you like. To my opinion, we are hiding behind the shield of NATO. Apparently, 95%, if not more, of the sorties where we are dropping tons of bombs on Yugoslavia and Kosovo are being carried out by the United States Air Force. The ground force that is expected to go in and take over that country is also American. Where is everybody else?
Is that the question?
Yes, sir, it is.
Okay. I'm sorry, I didn't hear much of a question in your statement.
Well, it was a question. It's basically, we seem to be running the show. Where is everybody else?
Well, everyone else, and this includes all 19 allies of NATO, is with us.
They're with us, but what are they doing?
Well, may I answer the question?
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. I've spent most of the past half dozen years of my life, in one way or another, dealing with the situation in the Balkans. It is tragic and ironic that this century, which began with violence in the Balkans, is ending with violence in the Balkans. Someone once commented that when the Balkans sneezes, Europe catches cold. One thing that we have learned the hard way in the 20th century is that when Europe sneezes, the United States catches cold. Europe has had, in my view, in this century, its second 100 years war. 2 of them have been hot and 1 of them has been cold. We learned the hard way that if we were not present as something of, if you will, a European power, we would be dragged in circumstances not of our own choosing. That is the worst situation, because you are in a reaction mode from day one. I arrived at the U.S. mission to NATO in 1991 for my second assignment there. And I very well recall the euphoria that we all felt. We felt this euphoria, first of all, because the Berlin Wall had fallen. And you may recall some experts, so-called, were declaring that, quote, history has come to an end. Well, we now know that that was not the case. In fact, we also know that the Cold War was the exception, not the rule, in human history. It was easy during the Cold War to say, here are the black hats, here are the white hats, here are the good guys. It was a John Wayne world. Now we're back to the kind of world that existed before 1945, before the nuclear menace. A very untidy, a very unappetizing, a very difficult, multipolar world. In any event, the Europeans came to us in 1991 and basically said, thank you for your leadership in the Gulf War. Really appreciate it. Great job. Now we have this cloud no bigger than a man's hand in our backyard. Let us show you that European unity is ready to take this on. And our response was, in effect, let us hold your coats. Unfortunately, what Europe proved is that Europe is not yet ready, and may not be ready for a long time, to exert the kind of leadership that would be necessary for us to stand back and say, okay, you do it. There are many reasons for that. Alan Larson talked at some length about, for example, European economic unity, which is impressive. But that unity has not been matched by political unity, nor by military unity. Political unity because Europe is still, and I mean the European Union, is still a collection of countries. It cannot be more than the sum of its parts. Military unity because every single force of every major country in Europe, except France, is under NATO command. And France has put its forces, its air forces, under NATO command for the purposes of serving in Kosovo. Now, it is true that the United States, as a consequence of its massive, massive preponderance during the Cold War, still has a lot more material, planes, troops, ships, armor, than any other country in the world, at least in Europe. I'm not referring to something like China, for example. That's not relevant here. But NATO, I think it helps to reread the North Atlantic Treaty, which basically says a threat on one is a threat on all. and we will respond according to our means. I frankly do not think that it's fair to our friends and allies who are carrying a proportional burden to the best extent that they can to insinuate that the United States is doing this alone. It's simply not true. The war in Kosovo is not my war. The war in Kosovo is a reaction to, as I said in my prepared talk, the last European tyrant. I would suggest that anyone who is interested in how the Yugoslavia that we know today ended up in this situation, read a book by Warren Zimmerman. That's Zimmerman with 2 M's and 2 N's. He was our last ambassador to the old Yugoslavia. He left in 1992. The book is called Origins of a Catastrophe. And in it, Zimmerman describes in excruciating detail his efforts and the efforts of a lot of dedicated people, Americans and others, to prevent the collapse of Yugoslavia. He also describes very eloquently the kinds of people he was up against, one of whom was named Slobodan Milosevic. Marshal Tito, for all of his bad side, after all, he was a dictator, had a vision, and that vision was a new nationality called Yugoslav. I'm going at this in some length, but I think it's worth doing. Yugoslav. He did that because he knew that under the surface that pressure cooker was still there and he was sitting on the lid. We can talk about the reasons for the pressure cooker if you wish. At the last census of the old Yugoslavia in 1990, 25% of the respondents put their nationality down as Yugoslav. Not Serb, not Croat, not Bosniak Muslim. Tito's idea was to get away from these very narrow, hyper-nationalist demagogues who were there. To be a Yugoslav was the last thing that Milosevic wanted, because to be a Yugoslav took away his power base. This is a man whose word is worthless. We cannot trust this man at all. I can't be more explicit. We cannot deal with this man as a normal leader. It is not a nice position for us to be in. But ladies and gentlemen, it is the price of leadership. If we care, we have to engage. And as I said in my prepared talks, we have to choose our engagements. This is one we cannot fail to engage on, because it is the last place in Western Europe that has not grown out of the nationalisms that killed Europe at the beginning of this century. I look at it through a historian's eye, and I say, we cannot do anything else. And I make no apologies for what we're doing.
My father was a volunteer in the Royal Air Force in World War I. I'd like to see some of the other NATO citizens be as courageous as some Americans were in World War I and World War II before this country got into the European war. Thank you.
Next question, please.
Yes, I'm also deeply troubled on the Balkans. We will have destroyed every bridge within the next 10 days. There'll be very little military targets left. People will not have running water. There'll be no power. 11 million Serbs are affected. If Milosevic doesn't capitulate, and I really don't think he will within the next 10 days, what does the United States do then? Thank you.
I appreciate your question because it's a dilemma we face daily. And I also appreciate the fact that you use the term military targets. I personally have no sympathy for striking non-military targets. The fact is, as we saw in World War II, and as we saw in Vietnam, striking non-military targets simply hardens the views of the people who are being struck. If they are struck accidentally, that is tragic, but they should not be struck, in my view, personally, intentionally. This is a military message to a man who understands nothing but force. And that's why it is a tough call. This is not an easy call. But I think the only thing worse than doing something is to do nothing. I can't answer your question, but I can say, and I don't know whether you were watching CNN earlier today, there are moves afoot to put the solution back into the diplomatic arena. We're right in the middle of them. I know it's a bit disingenuous to say watch this space, but that's about where we are right now. We're working with the other members of the G8, including the Russians. And the Russians, by the way, I am convinced, know that they've backed a really bad horse, to try to find a way to do what needs to be done. And let me give you just a summary of what we say needs to be done. This is from the Alliance, from NATO's statement on Kosovo during the summit. These are the 5 goals that NATO has put forward. And I'll read this in its entirety. Our military actions are directed not at the Serb people, but at the policies of the regime in Belgrade, which has repeatedly rejected all efforts to solve the crisis peacefully. President Milosevic must, 1, ensure a verifiable stop to all military action and the immediate ending of violence and repression in Kosovo. 2, withdraw from Kosovo his military, police, and paramilitary forces. 3, agree to the stationing in Kosovo of an international military presence. 4, agree to the unconditional and safe return of all refugees and displaced persons and unhindered access by them to them by humanitarian aid organizations. And 5, provide credible assurance of his willingness to work for the establishment of a political framework agreement based on the Rambouillet Accords. Those goals are still on the table. They have not changed.
Next, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very well informed, and I thank you very much for the discussion so far and the predecessor. But I have a question which is bothering me. I support every move to date on Kosovo, and I think we should do more and end that quickly. But with every Kosovo or any other place, I've heard you list the various National Guards and where they have operated. I'm yet to hear any concrete action on what the U.S. has done or plans to do and what is happening in Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and on. The terrains there are not as difficult as the Balkans. What would you do? I'm prepared to call my congressman to vote to increase your budget.
Did you bring your checkbook?
But with my vote, on condition that U.S. foreign policy towards Africa will be reviewed, because over the last 20 years, we've never got it right. Thank you.
Well, having served in Ouagadougou, I agree that there is much that needs to be done in Africa. But I think it's also fair to say that the United States has been among the leaders in trying to set things right that are wrong in Africa, although you're quite right that much more needs to be done, including by the Africans themselves. We have been working, for example, very closely with ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, on the Sierra Leone issue, and I have been personally engaged in trying to increase the amount of funding available for our support of Nigerian and other West African peacekeepers in Sierra Leone. Remember, once again, as I said before, we can't throw American bodies at every crisis. And geography and history does play a role. And this is why I think we have to put what happens in the Balkans at the top. It is not a racial matter, it's a geopolitical matter. I would say as well that in Nigeria, we have been among the leaders in pressing for democratization in Nigeria. You mentioned Rwanda and Burundi, one of the great tragedies of our time. And it is absolutely fair to say that not enough was done. You know, I think earlier in this decade, when a number of these crises and tragedies were occurring, there was a sense generally among the Western countries of denial. This can't be happening. The wall has just fallen. The millennium is upon us, literally. So why are these terrible things happening? And we turned our heads away. We should not have done that. And I think that we've learned lessons. Let me add that we've also learned lessons about something called peacekeeping. Ladies and gentlemen, peacekeeping is not a panacea. There was an assumption, again, earlier in the decade, that whenever there was a problem, the solution was to throw peacekeepers at it. But what did we learn in Somalia? You remember the Americans being dragged through the streets. You cannot use peacekeepers to keep the peace when there is no peace to keep. We've learned that whether they have blue helmets on or not, peacekeepers can only be used when there is agreement among warring parties to stop fighting and to let peacekeepers be put in the middle to act as referees. But peacekeepers cannot become war fighters. There's a difference, and this sounds perhaps a bit theological, but I think it's a fair statement, between peacekeeping, peace enforcement, and peacemaking. When you make peace, you go in shooting. It's a different situation. These are all things that we're learning in this brave new world that we're now in, a world in which the easy blacks and whites of the Cold War are gone and will never return.
Please join me in thanking our speaker, Mr. Beecroft, for his presentation.